The wagon wheels ground to a halt on the narrow, rutted path that wound up from the town of Pine Hollow, toward the dark line of pines and the looming gray peaks beyond. Dust settled in slow spirals around the wooden spokes. Mabel's heart pounded hard enough that she felt it in her throat, as her brother Elias yanked back the canvas flap and ordered her out with a jerk of his chin. His wife Clara sat rigid on the seat beside him, her mouth already twisted into the sneer Mabel had known since girlhood. Two men from town had ridden along for the spectacle, their voices loud with the kind of laughter that only ever came when someone else was about to be broken. "Get on with it then," Elias sneered, his tone carrying across the clearing to the weathered cabin and the large, sagging barn that stood beside it. "This is what you get for being more trouble than you're worth. The mountain man needs his barn cleaned out, and since no decent house in Pine Hollow will have you under their roof anymore, this is your punishment. Donna think about coming back when he sees what the town sent him. A man like that Donna need a burden like you hanging around." Clara's laugh was short and ugly. Looked at her. "He'll take one look at Muff, all that extra, and send her right back down the mountain. Or maybe he'll keep her to fatten up for winter. You've always had more than enough to spare, haven't you, Mabel?" One of the townsmen chuckled and spat in the dirt. "Enjoy your new master, girl. Hope he don't mind the extra weight." Mabel said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the wagon until the wood bit into her skin. She climbed down, her full figure making the drop to the ground awkward and unsteady. Her small bundle of belongings, 2 worn dresses, a shawl, and a comb was tossed out after her. It landed in a small puff of dust at her feet. The wagon turned sharply. The horse's hooves kicked up more dust as it rattled away, taking their laughter vacapite at it, until only the wind through the tall pines remained. Mabel stood in the clearing, the weight of their words still pressing on her chest like a stone. The barn loomed ahead, its doors half open, the cabin beyond it silent and still. No smoke rose from the chimney. No dog barked. Only the mountains watched. She bent, picked up her bundle, and walked toward the barn on legs that felt heavier than they should. The door creaked when she pushed it wider. The smell hit her first. Thick, sour, sweet layers of old manure, fermented hay that had gone musty, and the cold, metallic scent of damp earth that never quite dried in the mountain shade. Shafts of late afternoon light slanted through gaps between the planks, filled with dancing dust motes that swirled in lazy spirals whenever a breeze found its way inside. Her boots sank into the soiled straw vacapite hot. Each step, she found a rake leaning against a post, its tines bent from years of use, the wooden handle worn smooth in some places and rough with splinters in others. She wrapped both hands around it, feeling the wood press into her palms, and dragged it toward the nearest stall. The work began slowly. Each pull of the rake brought a satisfying scrape as packed straw gave way, revealing the wooden floorboards beneath. Her arms burned with the effort, but she kept moving, one stall at a time. Sweat gathered at the small of her back and along her hairline, dampening the faded blue cotton of her dress. The apron she wore was already streaked with dirt. The rake handle bit deeper into her calloused palms with every motion, a sharp grounding pain that kept her present when her mind wanted to drift back to the wagon and the things they had said. Yet even in the middle of the filth and labor, small mercies appeared. A narrow beam of sunlight shifted as the afternoon moved, and for several long minutes, it fell directly across her shoulders and the side of her face. The warmth soaked through the fabric of her dress and shawl, easing the chill that had settled in her bones during the ride up the mountain. She did not stop working, but she let her eyes close for 2 heartbeats, absorbing the simple gift of light and heat. She cleared the first stall and moved to the second. In the deepest shadows of the third, half hidden behind a broken feed trough, She found a mother cat curled tightly around 3 small kittens. The mother lifted her head, golden eyes wary but not afraid. Mabel slowed her movements, stepping carefully around the nest. Her lips curved upward in spite of everything, a small, private smile that no one else would see. She left that corner untouched, the rake moving in wider arcs to give the little family their peace. The work was hard, but it was hers. No one stood over her telling her she was too slow or too big to be useful. No laughter followed every bend of her back or every heavy breath she took. The only sounds were the rake's scrape, the rustle of straw, and her own steady breathing that fogged faintly in the cooler air near the floor. If this story of a woman sent to the edge of everything and finding the first honest work she had known in years is one that stays with you, perhaps you will like it and leave a thought in the comments about what you hope the mountain man will see when he looks at her standing there in his barn. As the 4th stall began to take shape under her hands, her thoughts turned inward, the way they sometimes did when her body was busy and her heart was quiet. They had sent her here to humiliate her, to make sure she understood. She was a burden no one wanted to carry anymore. The words still rang in her ears: burden, extra, joke. The scar on her left cheek seemed to throb with the memory of the shove that had put it there years ago, the shove that had come with the same laughter she had heard today. Yet here, with the mountains rising behind the barn and the town far below, the labor felt different. It felt like something she could finish. Something that might even matter to the man who lived in the silent cabin beyond the door. For the first time in many years, the absence of watching, judging eyes let a small piece of her spirit stretch without fear of being mocked for taking up space. She straightened for a moment, one hand pressing into the small of her back, and let the thought settle like dust in the light. She paused to wipe her brow with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of dirt across her skin. A loose strand of light brown hair had escaped her bun and clung to her cheek. She tucked it behind her ear, with fingers that trembled only slightly, then adjusted the shawl around her shoulders, pulling it closer, as if the familiar wool could steady her against whatever came next. A sudden gust of wind pushed through the open barn door, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine resin and cold mountain air. It cut through the heavy smells of the barn and brushed cool against her flushed face and neck. For a moment, the air tasted like freedom. She had cleared nearly half the barn when her legs began to shake with fatigue. She righted an overturned bucket in a patch of cleaner straw and lowered herself onto it, her full weight settling with a soft creak. Her bundle sat nearby, untouched. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she ignored it. There would be time enough to worry about food when the work was done, or when the mountain man decided what to do with the woman the town had left on his doorstep. The light had turned long and golden. She was about to stand and continue when a sound that did not belong to her own movements reached her. The slow, heavy creak of a floorboard near the wide entrance. Mabel stilled, the rake resting across her knees. She turned her head. In the open doorway stood a man taller and broader than any she had ever seen. His frame filled the space from side to side, his heavy brown wool coat stretched across shoulders that looked as though they could carry the weight of the entire mountain range. A thick dark beard covered the lower half of his face, and above it his deep gray eyes watched her without blinking, without any expression she could name. He did not speak. He did not step inside or turn away. He simply stood there, his large hands loose at his sides, his presence as solid and unmoving as the peaks behind him. The rake slipped a fraction of an inch in her grip. This was the man they had sent her to. The one they called the giant. The beast. The one good people avoided. And he had been standing there long enough to see her working in his barn, like she belonged to the place. Mabel's breath caught. She did not know whether to stand, to speak, or to simply wait for the judgment that was surely coming. The dust continued its slow dance in the light between them, and neither of them moved. Mabel's fingers tightened around the rake handle until her knuckles ached. She waited for him to speak, to sneer, to tell her to get out of his barn and off his land like everyone else had. But the towering man only stood there, his gray eyes moving slowly over the cleared stalls, the neat piles of old straw she had dragged to the side, the mother cat and her kittens still safe in their corner. He did not frown. He did not laugh. He simply looked, and the weight of that look pressed the air from her lungs. She lowered the rake an in, then another. Her heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it. The town had called him a beast, a giant who lived alone because no one could stand the sight of him. Yet the man who filled the doorway did not move toward her with threat. He only watched, and in the watching, there was no cruelty she could name. After a long moment, he stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Each step seemed to make the barn smaller, yet he moved with a carefulness that surprised her, as though he knew his size could frighten and chose not to use it. He stopped near the stall she had finished, and studied the clean boards she had revealed. His head tilted slightly, the only sign that he had noticed her work at all. Mabel stayed frozen, the rake now hanging loose at her side. She had expected shouting. She had expected to be grabbed and thrown out into the coming dark. Instead, the mountain man turned without a word and walked back out the way he had come. The barn felt suddenly larger and colder without him in it. She did not know what to do with the relief that flooded her. Her legs trembled, so she sat on the overturned bucket again, the rake across her knees. The mother cat watched her from the shadows, golden eyes unblinking. Mabel let out a shaky breath she had not realized she was holding and pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat beneath her palm. He returned before she could decide whether to keep working or gather her bundle and run. In one large hand he carried a dented tin bucket sloshing with water. In the other he held a tin plate with 2 thick slices of dark bread, a wedge of cheese, and a strip of dried meat. He set both on the bucket she sat upon, then stepped back 2 paces. His eyes met hers for the space of 3 heartbeats. Then he turned and left again. Mabel stared at the offering. The water in the bucket was clear, cold from a mountain spring. The bread smelled of wood smoke and honest flour. Her stomach clenched so hard it hurt, but she did not reach for it at once. She waited to see if this was another kind of joke, if he would return laughing, or take it back. When he did not reappear, she lifted the cup kept hot both hands. The metal was cool against her lips. The first swallow of water tasted sweeter than anything she could remember. She drank slowly, letting it wash the dust and fear from her throat. Only then did she pick up the bread. It was coarse and dense, the crust rough against her fingers, but when she bit into it, the taste was rich and real. The cheese was sharp and good. The dried meat was salty and chewy. She ate every crumb, careful not to drop any where the cat might not reach it. Strength returned to her arms and legs in small, steady waves. She had not realized how empty she had become until the food filled the hollow spaces. The mother cat crept closer while Mabel ate. One cautious paw, then another. When Mabel remained still, the cat rubbed the side of its face against her skirt, a low rumble starting in its throat. Mabel's lips curved again, the same small smile she had given the kittens earlier. She tore off a corner of cheese and placed it on the straw. The cat took it delicately, then settled beside her leg as if she had earned the right to stay. When the plate was empty, Mabel rose. The water had revived her. The food had steadied her hands. She picked up the rake and returned to the next stall, working with a rhythm that felt almost easy now. The mountain man had not thrown her out. He had not mocked the way her body moved, or the dirt on her face. He had simply given her water and bread, and left her to the work she had been sent to do. She did not hear him return the second time. One moment she was alone with the cat and the fading light, and the next a shadow fell across the straw. She turned, heart leaping, but it was only him again. He carried a small lantern, its flame protected behind tin and glass. He hung it on a hook near the door so that warm yellow light pooled across the floor she had cleared. Then he moved to the far corner where the straw was still deep and old. With his bare hands, he pulled the soiled bedding away until clean boards showed. He spread fresh, dry straw in a thick layer, working with the same unhurried strength she had seen in his stillness. When the corner was ready, he placed her bundle there, the shawl folded on top. Mabel watched him, the rake forgotten in her hands. No one had ever made a place for her without being asked. No one had ever looked at the mess she had been given and quietly made it better. The town's joke had been to send the chubby girl to the feared giant, so everyone could laugh at how quickly she would fail or flee. Yet here she stood, fed and given light and a clean place to rest, and the giant had not asked for anything in return. He finished the sleeping spot and straightened. For a moment he stood with his back to her, his broad shoulders rising and falling with slow breaths. Then he walked to the stool near the door and sat, facing outward toward the path that led down the mountain. He did not look at her again. He simply sat, as solid and unmoving as the peaks themselves. The last light left the sky. The lantern hissed softly. Mabel finished the stall she had been working on, then carried the rake to the wall and leaned it there. Her body was tired, in a clean way now, not the bone-deep exhaustion of fear. She walked to the corner he had prepared. The straw was soft beneath her boots. She lowered herself onto it, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and lay on her side facing the barn door. The blanket came later. She had thought he had gone to the cabin. Instead, he returned with something heavy and dark, folded over one arm. He crossed the barn without sound, knelt beside her with a care that seemed impossible for a man his size, and draped the wool blanket over her body. It smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the same clean cold that lived in the mountain air. His large hands adjusted the edge so it covered her feet, then withdrew. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He only made sure she was warm. Mabel lay very still beneath the unexpected weight. The blanket was the most generous thing anyone had given her in years. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She would not cry in front of him. She would not give the town that satisfaction, even in memory. Thorne returned to the stool. He sat vacate hot, his back straight, his gaze on the dark path beyond the open door. The mother cat had moved to the sleeping corner as well, and now curled against Mabel's stomach, a small warm weight. The lantern light caught on the mountain man's profile, the strong line of his jaw beneath the beard, the way his eyes never seemed to rest even when his body was still. Mabel watched him through half-closed lashes. The fear that had lived in her chest since the wagon arrived had changed shape. It was no longer sharp and loud. It had become something quieter, something that asked questions she did not yet have words for. Who was this man who lived alone and yet opened his barn to the woman the town had thrown away? Why had he fed her and made her a place to sleep instead of sending her back down the mountain with fresh bruises and fresh laughter ringing in her ears? She was still turning the questions over when his voice came, low and rough from long disuse, barely louder than the wind outside. Name Sass Thorne. The words settled in the lantern light between them. Mabel did not answer. She could not. Her throat had closed around too many feelings at once. She only lay there, the blanket warm around her, the cat purring against her middle, and listened to the sound of his breathing in the dark. Outside, far down the mountain path, someone laughed. The sound was thin and mean, the same laughter that had followed the wagon that morning. It drifted up through the pines and found the open barn door. Thorne did not move. He did not turn his head, but Mabel saw his shoulders settle, just slightly, as if he had been waiting for that sound, and was now certain it would come no closer. She closed her eyes at last. The questions still turning. The blanket still carrying the scent of the man who had given it. Sleep came slowly, but when it came it was deep and dreamless, guarded by the silent giant who had not asked her to earn the safety he offered. Mabel woke to pale sunlight, slanting through the high gaps in the barn walls, and the soft weight of the mother cat curled against her stomach. The heavy wool blanket still covered her to the chin, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke, and the man who had placed it there. For a moment she lay still, listening. No wagon wheels, no laughter, only the low rustle of wind in the pines outside and the steady breathing of the cat. Thorne was gone from the stool by the door. The barn felt larger without his presence, yet somehow less empty than it had the day before. She sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the cat. The straw beneath her had stayed dry and surprisingly comfortable. She folded the blanket with the same care she had once used on her mother's quilts, smoothing every crease before laying it across the stool where he had sat through the night. Her fingers lingered on the wool for a breath longer than necessary. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty barn. The words felt small and foolish, yet she said them anyway. She rolled up the sleeves of her faded blue dress, tied a piece of clean twine she found on a nail around her loose hair to keep it from her face, and picked up the rake. The work waited. It had waited all night while she slept under a stranger's blanket, and it would wait no longer. The barn looked different in the morning light. Where yesterday there had been only shadows and filth, now there were clear patches of wooden floor and neat piles of old straw waiting to be taken outside. Mabel began where she had left off, pulling the rake through the next stall with steady, rhythmic pulls. Each scrape of the tines against the boards sent a small cloud of dust into the golden shafts of light. The air that had smelled of rot and damp the day before now carried the sharper, cleaner scent of fresh straw and the faint resin of pine that drifted in through the open door. She breathed it in deeply, letting it fill her lungs and push out the last of the night's questions. She worked without hurry and without hesitation. This was not the kind of labor her brother had forced on her at home. The endless, thankless tasks meant to remind her she was too slow, too big, too much trouble to be worth feeding. This was work she had been given, and she would do it well, because it was honest, and because no one was standing over her, waiting for her to fail. The rejection that had followed her down the mountain path yesterday had nowhere to land here. There was only the rake in her hands, the straw giving way, and the growing satisfaction of seeing order emerge where there had been none. The mother cat followed her from stall to stall, pausing now and then to bat at a loose piece of straw, before settling again to watch. Its golden eyes never left Mabel for long, as if it had decided this new human was acceptable. Once, when Mabel paused to wipe sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, the cat rubbed its head against her ankle and purred. The small sound vibrated through the quiet barn like a secret the two of them shared. By mid-morning, the main aisle was clear enough to walk without sinking into filth. Mabel found an old broom in the corner, its bristles worn but still useful, and began sweeping the fine dust into neat piles. She discovered a row of pegs along one wall that had been hidden beneath years of grime. One by one she lifted the tools she had used, the rake, a shovel with a cracked handle, a pitchfork with bent tines, and hung them in order of size. The simple act of placing each tool where it belonged gave her a quiet sense of rightness she had not felt in a long time. Her hands knew what to do. Her body, for all its softness and all the ways the town had mocked it, moved with purpose here. A small bird flew in through the open door and perched on the top beam for a moment, its head cocked as if inspecting the changes. It sang a short, bright phrase before darting back out into the sunlight. Mabel smiled at the empty space it left behind. Even the birds seemed to approve of what she was doing. She was reaching for a crate that had been shoved against the back wall when Thorne appeared in the doorway again. He carried a tin cup in one large hand and a folded cloth in the other. He set both on the clean patch of floor near the stool without a word, then turned and walked back outside. The smell of strong coffee and warm bread reached her before she even moved. Mabel wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to the offering. The coffee was hot and black, the steam rising in a fragrant curl. The cloth held 2 thick slices of bread and a piece of cheese. She ate standing up, the coffee burning her tongue in the best way, the bread filling the hollow that had opened in her stomach during the morning's work. Strength returned to her arms and back in steady waves. When she finished, she carried the empty cup and cloth outside the barn and set them on the stump where Thorne had been splitting wood. He did not look up from the axe, but she saw the slight nod of his head before she turned back inside. The work felt different after that. Not easier. The straw was still heavy, and the dust still clung to her skin and hair, but lighter in her chest. She was not cleaning this barn because the town had punished her. She was cleaning it because she could. Because her hands were good at it, and because, for the first time in years, the result would be something she could stand back and look at with pride instead of shame. The town had tried to make her small. Here, in the quiet space between the mountain man's silence and the honest labor, she was taking up room in a way that felt like claiming something back. She moved to the far end of the barn, where old crates and barrels had been stacked for years. Most were empty or filled with a hat, rusted nails, and broken harness parts. She began sorting them, dragging the empty ones outside to be burned later, and stacking the useful ones against the wall. One crate sat higher than the others, wedged into a shadowed shelf. She stretched on her toes, her full figure making the reach awkward, and pulled it down carefully. It was lighter than she expected. Something inside shifted with a soft rattle. Mabel set the crate on a clean patch of floor and lifted the lid. Inside lay a small wooden box, its lid carved with a simple pattern of mountains and trees. The wood was smooth from handling. She opened it. A bundle of old letters tied with faded ribbon rested beside a small locket and a carved wooden horse no bigger than her palm. The horse's paint had worn away in places, but the lines were still proud and careful. She lifted the locket and let it rest in her palm. It was cold and heavy. When she opened it, she found a tiny photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, the kind of smile that made you want to sit beside her and tell her everything. A floorboard creaked behind her. Mabel turned, the locket still open in her hand. Thorne stood in the aisle, his massive frame blocking the light from the door. His eyes went first to the open box on the floor, then to the locket in her palm. Something moved across his face, not anger, but a deep, old pain that made the gray of his eyes darken like storm clouds over the peaks. He did not speak. He simply crossed the space between them in 3 slow steps, reached down and took the locket from her hand with a gentleness that did not match his size. His fingers brushed hers for the briefest moment, calloused and warm. He closed the locket, placed it back inside the wooden box, and tucked the box under his coat without looking at her again. Then he turned and walked out of the barn. Mabel stood where he had left her, her empty hand still half raised, the carved wooden horse still resting in the open crate at her feet. The barn that had felt like a place she was beginning to claim now felt smaller again, the air heavier with the things she did not understand. The cat rubbed against her leg, but Mabel did not move. She only stared at the empty space where the box had been, and listened to the sound of Thorne's axe striking wood once more, steady and distant, as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had. Mabel lowered her hand slowly. The carved wooden horse still lay in the crate at her feet. She picked it up, turning it over in her palm. The lines were careful, made by someone who loved the shape of it. She placed it gently back inside the crate and closed the lid, then pushed the crate against the wall where it had been. She would not touch his things again, but the barn still needed her hands. She returned to the aisle and picked up the broom. The simple act of sweeping felt different now. Before Thorne had taken the box, the work had been about proving she could survive the punishment. Now it was about something quieter and fiercer. She wanted the barn to be better because she could make it better. No one had ever asked her to do that before. No one had ever looked at the way she straightened a room or organized a shelf and seen anything worth keeping. Here, with only the mountain and the silent man for witnesses, she let herself do what she had always been good at. She found an old tin of grease on a high shelf and used a rag to oil the wooden handles of every tool she had hung. The rag moved in slow circles, bringing out the grain of the wood and the faint shine of metal that had been hidden under rust and dirt. When she finished, the row of tools looked almost new. She stepped back and let her eyes rest on them. A small, private satisfaction rose in her chest. It was not the loud kind of pride the town would have mocked. It was quieter, the kind that settled in her bones and made her stand a little straighter. The mother cat watched from the clean corner Mabel had made for her and the kittens. She had dragged fresh straw into a low wooden box she found behind the barrels, and lined it with an old feed sack she had mended kept hat needle and thread from her bundle. The stitches were small and even. When she finished, the mother cat had climbed in without hesitation, her kittens tumbling after her. Now the cat sat at the edge of the box like a queen on a throne, golden eyes half closed in approval. Once she brought Mabel a dead mouse and left it neatly by her boot. Mabel had laughed under her breath, a soft sound that surprised her, and thanked the cat in a whisper before carrying the mouse outside. She worked through the heat of the day without stopping for more than a drink of water from the bucket Thorne had left. The barn slowly changed shape around her. Crates that had been scattered were now stacked by size against the back wall. Nails and screws she had sorted into old jars sat in a neat row on a shelf she had wiped clean. Broken harness straps she could not mend, she coiled and hung on separate pegs so they would not tangle with the good ones. The air that had once been thick with decay now smelled of clean wood, oiled leather, and the sharp green scent of the pine branches she had swept in from outside to freshen the corners. A patch of wildflowers grew just beyond the open door, small blue blooms that had somehow found purchase in the rocky soil. Mabel picked a handful, careful not to take too many, and placed them in a cleaned tin cup on the shelf near the tools. The tiny splash of color looked out of place in the working barn, yet it felt right. Something soft in a place that had known only hard things. She was mending the torn edge of an old canvas tarp when Thorne returned. He carried an armload of split wood and stopped just inside the doorway. His eyes moved slowly over the transformed space. The ordered tools, the clean floor, the labeled jars, the flowers in the tin cup. He did not smile. He rarely did. But something in the set of his shoulders eased, and he gave one short nod before stacking the wood near the stove in the corner that had once been buried under trash. Mabel kept her hands busy on the tarp, so she would not have to look at him too long. The quiet approval in that single nod was more than she had received from anyone in years. It settled in her chest like the sunlight that now reached all the way to the back wall. When she finished the tarp, she folded it and placed it on a high shelf where it would stay dry. Then, she turned to the last section of the barn, the one she had avoided because it held the heaviest crates. She was trying to shift one that had wedged itself under a low beam when Thorne appeared beside her without a sound. He lifted the crate as if it weighed nothing and set it where she pointed. He did not speak. He only waited to see if she needed anything else moved. When she shook her head, he returned to his woodpile outside. The small act of help left her standing in the middle of the aisle with her hands empty, and her heart strangely full. She had spent her whole life being told her size made her clumsy and useless. Yet here a man who could move mountains with his hands had waited for her direction before moving a single crate. The thought made her throat tighten. She swallowed hard and went back to work. By late afternoon, the barn no longer looked like a place of punishment. It looked like a place someone might choose to keep. Mabel stood in the center aisle and let her eyes travel over everything she had touched. The tools hung in order. The supplies were sorted and labeled with charcoal marks on scraps of wood. The cat and her kitten slept in their clean box. The flowers in the tin cup caught the last golden light. For the first time since the wagon had left her here, she felt the stirrings of something that might have been hope. She was wiping her hands on her apron when she heard the low creak of floorboards behind her. Thorne had come back inside. He stood near the doorway again, but this time he was not watching her work. His gaze was fixed on a small trunk she had pulled out from under the workbench earlier and had not yet opened. It was old, the leather straps cracked, the lock rusted through. She had meant to ask him about it, but the words had stayed in her throat. Now he crossed to it in 3 steps and knelt. His large hands were careful as he lifted the lid. Inside lay folded clothes, small shirts, a pair of tiny trousers, a wool cap that had once been blue. On top of the clothes rested a child S drawing on a piece of bark, the lines crude but clear. 2 stick figures, one very tall, one very small, standing beside a barn that looked almost like this one. Mabel's breath caught. She had not meant to find this. She had only been trying to make the space usable. Thorne did not close the trunk. He stayed, kneeling, one hand resting on the small blue cap. His shoulders, always so solid, looked heavier than she had ever seen them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. The words meant more for the things in the trunk than for her. "He'll be back soon." Mabel did not move. She did not ask who he was or where the child had gone, or why Thorne kept his clothes in a locked trunk in the barn. She only stood in the clean, ordered space she had made, and felt the weight of the question settle between them, like the dust that had once filled every corner. Outside, the wind picked up. It carried the faint sound of voices on the path from town. Not laughter this time, but something lower and more determined. Thorne's head lifted. His eyes met hers for one long moment. In them she saw the same steady protection he had shown when he brought her water and bread. But she also saw the old pain from the box, and the small clothes, and the drawing on the bark. He closed the trunk gently, stood, and walked to the doorway. He did not tell her to hide or to run. He simply took up his place between her and whatever was coming up the mountain. His broad back blocking the light. His silence now a wall she was no longer certain she wanted to stay behind. Yet the voices kept coming. The voices grew louder as they climbed the last stretch of the path. Mabel could pick out her brother's sharp tone and Clara's higher, cutting laugh. There were others with them, 2 men from town, whose words carried the same ugly amusement that had followed the wagon 2 days ago. Thorne did not move from the doorway. His broad back filled the opening completely, his hands loose at his sides, his stillness more commanding than any shout. Mabel stayed inside the barn, her heart beating hard against her ribs. She had been straightening the last of the harnesses when the sound reached her. Now she stood near the cat's box, one hand resting on the edge of the clean straw. The mother cat had risen, ears flat, a low growl rumbling in her chest at the unfamiliar voices. Her kittens had scattered into the shadows. "Send her out," Thorne, Elias called from the clearing. "The joke's gone on long enough. The town wants its entertainment back. Or did you decide to keep the chubby girl after all?" Clara's laugh rang out. "She's probably already made herself at home in your filth. Look at the place. She's playing house like she belongs here. Come on, out, Mabel. Let's see how the giant likes his new maid." One of the townsmen added something lower and meaner that Mabel could not quite catch, but the tone was enough. She felt the old shame try to rise in her throat. She swallowed it down. The barn around her was clean and ordered now. She had made it that way with her own hands. The words from outside could not undo the work she had done. Thorne's voice came low and steady, carrying across the clearing without effort. "She stays." The simple words landed like stones. The laughter faltered for a moment, then returned, thinner this time. Mabel turned her attention to the mother cat, who was now pacing in agitation. One of the kittens had ventured too close to the open doorway, drawn by the light or the noise. Its small body trembled as it tried to decide whether to run toward the voices or back to safety. Mabel moved without thinking. She knelt slowly, her full figure folding with careful grace, and extended one hand, palm up, toward the kitten. Her voice dropped to the same low, steady murmur she had used when the town's cruelty had been at its worst. "Easy now, little one. They not coming in. You safe here." The kitten hesitated, then took one wobbly step toward her. Mabel stayed perfectly still, letting the small creature come to her on its own terms. When it reached her fingers, she scooped it up hot both hands, cradling it against the soft warmth of her apron. The kitten's heart beat fast against her palm. She stroked its tiny head with one fingertip, her touch so light it barely disturbed the fur. The mother cat watched from the box, but she did not hiss. She seemed to understand that this large, quiet woman was not the threat outside. From the doorway, Thorne glanced back once. His eyes took in the scene, Mabel kneeling with the kitten. Her face soft with concentration. Her body curved protectively around the small life in her hands. He said nothing. But he did not turn away again. He remained the wall between her and the voices. The boy had come with them. Mabel had not noticed him at first. He stood half-hidden behind one of the townsmen, a thin child of perhaps 7 or 8 with dark hair and eyes too old for his face. He had been laughing when they first arrived, repeating the words the others used. Fat girl, joke, giant S, new toy. But as the moments passed and Mabel stayed focused on the kitten, his laughter faded. He stepped out from behind the man and moved closer to the barn door, his head tilted. Mabel did not look at him. She kept her attention on the kitten, murmuring the same gentle words until its trembling eased and it began to purr. A tiny rumble against her chest. Only then did she glance up. The boy was staring at her, not with the cruel amusement the town wore so easily, but with something quieter and more uncertain. His eyes moved from the kitten, in her hands to the clean, ordered barn behind her, then back to her face, the scar on her cheek, the way her dress pulled across her full figure as she knelt. The hands that had been mocked for being too soft and too slow were now steady and kind, around a creature that trusted her without question. He did not laugh again. Elias noticed the boy's stillness and snapped his fingers. Come on, boy. Nothing to see here but the giant S new pet. We Leglunk come back tomorrow. Vekepite hat more of the town. See if Thorne still thinks he can keep what does he belong to him. The group began to turn. Clara threw one last sneer over her shoulder. Enjoy your barn, Mabel. It's the only place that Leglunk have you. They started down the path. The boy lingered a moment longer. His eyes met Mabel S. across the short distance. He did not smile. He did not sneer. He simply looked at her the way a child looks when something they have been told all their life turns out to be wrong. Then he turned and ran after the others, his small feet kicking up dust on the path. Mabel remained kneeling until the voices faded completely. The kitten had fallen asleep in her hands, its tiny body warm and trusting. She carried it back to the box and placed it gently beside its mother. The cat sniffed her fingers once, then settled with a purr that seemed to say the danger had passed. Thorne still stood in the doorway. He had not moved since the group left. The light behind him had shifted to the long gold of late afternoon. When he finally turned, his eyes went first to the kitten box, then to Mabel. Something in his face had softened at the edges, though the lines around his eyes remained deep. He saw you, Thorne said. The words low and rough. The boy. He saw what they refused to. Mabel rose slowly, brushing straw from her apron. Her heart was still beating fast, but not only from fear. There had been something in the boy's eyes. A crack in the wall the town had built around her. A child had looked at Motfever and seen kindness instead of the joke. It was such a small thing. Yet it felt larger than anything that had happened since the wagon left her here. She wanted to ask about the boy. She wanted to ask why his clothes were in the trunk and why Thorne's voice had gone quiet when he spoke of him coming back. She wanted to know if the drawing on the bark had been made by those small hands. But the question stayed behind her teeth. Thorne's silence was still a wall, even if it was no longer one that kept her out. Instead, she walked to the doorway and stood beside him, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence against the cooling air. The path down the mountain was empty now. The wildflowers she had placed in the tin cup caught the last light and glowed softly on the shelf behind them. Thorne did not look at her. His gaze stayed on the trees where the boy had disappeared. But after a long moment he spoke again, the words barely louder than the wind. His name is Caleb. Mabel nodded once. She did not ask more. The name settled between them like the straw she had spread that morning. Something new laid down carefully. Something that might grow if neither of them disturbed it too soon. Outside, the pines whispered. Inside the barn, the mother cat and her kittens slept in the clean box Mabel had made. The tools hung in ordered rows. The flowers in the tin cup held their color against the coming dark. And for the first time since she had been left here, Mabel felt the smallest, most dangerous spark of belonging flicker to life in her chest. She did not ove kept, yet what it would cost her to keep it. The night passed quietly after that. Mabel slept under the heavy wool blanket again. The mother cat and her kittens curled against her side like a small living shield. Thorne had disappeared into the cabin after the group left, but she had heard him moving around for a long time. The sound of wood being stacked, the creak of floorboards, the low murmur of his voice, speaking to someone who was not there. She had not tried to listen. Some silences were meant to be respected. In the morning she rose early, folded the blanket, and returned to the work that had become hers. The barn was already transformed, but there were still small things to mend and arrange. She oiled the last of the hinges on the big doors, swept the fine dust that had settled overnight, and checked the cat's box to make sure the straw was still clean and dry. The simple act steadied her hands and her heart. The town had threatened to return. She would meet whatever came with a barn that no longer looked like a place of punishment. Thorne appeared mid-morning with a tin cup of coffee and 2 boiled eggs wrapped in a cloth. He set them on the stump near the woodpile without a word. Mabel ate standing up, the coffee hot and strong, the eggs simple and good. When she finished, she carried the empty cup back to the cabin door and left it on the step. Thorne was splitting wood again, the axe rising and falling with steady power. He glanced at her once, gave the same short nod he had given the day before, and returned to his work. The small exchange felt almost like a routine. The group returned just after midday. This time there were more of them, 8 or 9 men and women from Pine Hollow, some carrying sticks or ropes as if they expected trouble. Elias and Clara walked at the front. The boy Caleb trailed behind them, his small face pale and set. He did not laugh this time. He kept his eyes on the barn door and said nothing. Elias stopped at the edge of the clearing and raised his voice so it would carry. "We've come for the girl. Thorne, The town had enough of this game. You've had your fun. Send her out, and we Luglung take her back where she belongs. Or we Luglung come in and get her ourselves." Clara added her own sharp words. "She's not your problem. Mountain man." The joke was never meant to last. "Look at her. She's already turned your barn into some kind of palace. She thinks she's better than the rest of us now. We'll remind her of her place." One of the townsmen laughed and slapped a rope against his palm. "Come on out, and Mabel. Let's see if the giant still wants you when the whole town is watching." Mabel stood just inside the barn door, one hand resting on the frame. Her heart pounded, but she did not step back. The barn she had cleaned and ordered felt like armor around her. She kept her spine straight and her eyes on the group, even when their words tried to pull her down to the old shame. Thorne had been stacking wood near the cabin. He set the last log down with deliberate care, then turned and walked toward the group. He did not hurry, he did not raise his voice. He simply moved, and the ground seemed to shift under the weight of him. When he stopped, he stood between the barn and the clearing, his massive frame blocking the path, the way a cliff blocks a storm. His voice, when it came, was low and final. "She stays." Elias tried to laugh, but the sound died quickly. "You can keep her, Thorne." She's not yours. The town sent her here as a joke. You supposed to throw her out, or use her, and send her back broken. That's how this works. Thorne took one step forward. The group instinctively shifted back. Even Elias's shoulders tightened. This ends now, Thorne said. The words were not loud, but they carried the same unyielding weight as the mountains behind him. She is under my protection. Anyone who comes here to harm her will answer to me. Go back to your town. Tell them the joke is over. For a long moment no one moved. The only sound was the wind in the pines and the faint creak of leather as someone's hand tightened on a rope. Mabel could feel the tension in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. She stayed where she was, one hand still on the doorframe, and watched the man everyone feared stand between her and the cruelty she had known all her life. Caleb had edged closer to the front of the group. His eyes were wide and fixed on Thorne, then on Mabel. He did not speak. He did not join the others when they began to mutter and shift their feet. Clara was the first to break. She grabbed Elias's arm. Come on. He's not going to hand her over. We look Lung come back with more people. We look Lung bring the preacher. We'll make it official. Elias glared at Thorne, then at Mabel. This isn't finished, he spat. You look regret choosing the town's joke over your own kind. They turned and started down the path. A few of the men threw ugly looks over their shoulders, but no one dared challenge Thorne's presence again. Caleb lingered the longest. He looked at Mabel one more time, his small face unreadable, then turned and ran after the others. When the last of them had disappeared into the trees, the silence that followed was so complete it rang in Mabel's ears. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her fingers were cramped from gripping the doorframe. She flexed them slowly and stepped out into the sunlight. Thorne remained where he was for another long moment, his back to her, his shoulders rising and falling with steady breaths. Then he turned. His gray eyes met hers. There was no triumph in them, only the same quiet steadiness that had been there since the first day she arrived. Mabel walked toward him. She stopped a few paces away, close enough to speak without raising her voice. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. They would have left eventually. You could have let them take me and saved yourself the trouble. Thorne looked at her for a long time. The wind moved through his beard and the edges of his coat. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, as if the words cost him something. Yes, I did. He turned then and walked back toward the woodpile. Mabel watched him go, her chest tight with something she could not yet name. The protection he had given her was not the loud, showy kind the town would have respected. It was the kind that simply refused to move, that made cruel people remember they were small, and he had done it for her, the woman the town had sent as a joke. She returned to the barn on legs that felt steadier than they had in years. The mother cat came out of her box and wound around her ankles, purring loudly. Mabel bent and scratched behind the cat's ears, the small warmth of the animal's trust settling something inside her. Later, when the afternoon light had turned long and golden, Thorne brought her a simple meal. More bread, a piece of cheese and a tin cup of broth that smelled of herbs and slow cooking. He set it on the stump and sat on a log a short distance away, his axe resting across his knees. He did not speak. He did not need to. The shared quiet felt like the first real companionship Mabel had known since she was a girl. She ate slowly, the broth warming her from the inside. When she finished, she carried the cup to the cabin step again. This time, Thorne was still sitting on the log. She hesitated, then spoke without turning around. "Thank you." He did not answer right away. The axe rose and fell once, splitting a log cleanly. Then, his voice came, low and steady. No one stood for her either. Mabel froze on the step. She did not ask who her was. She already knew. The small clothes in the trunk, the drawing on the bark. The way Thorne's eyes had softened when he spoke Caleb's name. The protection he gave her was not only for her. It was for something older and deeper. Something that had broken him long before the town sent her up the mountain. She turned slowly. Thorne was looking at the path where the group had disappeared. His face closed again. The flicker of old pain already hidden behind the mountain man's stillness. He split another log. The sound was sharp and final in the quiet afternoon. Mabel stood on the cabin step with the empty cup in her hands and felt the dangerous spark of belonging grow brighter and more terrifying at the same time. She had found safety in the shadow of the one person everyone else feared. But safety, she was beginning to understand, always came with a cost, and she did not yet know whose heart would have to pay it. The days after the confrontation settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost like peace. Mabel rose early each morning and tended the barn with the same careful hands that had transformed it. The tools stayed in their ordered rows. The cat and her kittens grew bolder, often following Mabel as she worked. Thorne split wood, mended fences, and moved through his solitary chores with the same steady presence that had first frightened her and now felt like the most reliable thing in her world. They spoke little, yet the silences between them had changed. They were no longer the silences of strangers. They were the silences of two people learning how to share space without needing to fill it with words. On the fourth morning, after the group had come and gone, Thorne appeared at the barn door while Mabel was oiling the last hinge. He carried a folded piece of paper in one large hand, a list of supplies and livestock he needed from the valley auction that happened once a month. He held it out without explanation. "We leave at first light tomorrow," he said. His voice was low and matter-of-fact, as if taking her to a public place where half the valley would stare was the most ordinary thing in the world. "You know, animals. You know what lasts. Mort want your eyes on the stock before Mort bid." Mabel took the list. Her fingers brushed his for the briefest moment. She looked at both the neat rows of her own handwriting on the page, the careful marks she had made while organizing the barn, and felt something shift inside her chest. He was not sending her away. He was asking her to come with him, to stand beside him in a place where people would see them together. She nodded once. "All right." The wagon ride down the mountain the next morning was the first time Mabel had left the cabin and barn since the day she arrived. The world opened up around them in wide sweeps of pine and rock and distant blue peaks. The morning air was cool and sharp. Thorne drove ve kepite hot, steady hands on the reins. Mabel sat beside him on the hard seat, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her full figure taking up more space than she used to apologize for. She did not apologize now. She simply sat, and Thorne did not seem to mind the way the wagon leaned slightly toward her side. They reached the auction grounds in the valley by mid-morning. The place was already loud and crowded, pens of cattle and horses, rows of wagons loaded ve, kep ite hat feed and tools and household goods, the smell of dust, manure, hay and strong coffee from the food stalls. Men shouted bids. Auctioneers called out numbers in rapid-fire voices. Women moved between the stalls ve kepite hot baskets on their arms, children darting underfoot. It was the kind of place where everyone looked at everyone else and measured what they saw. Heads turned when Thorne climbed down from the wagon. They always did. His size alone made people step back and give him room. When Mabel climbed down after him, the stairs lingered longer. Whispers moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. She heard fragments. The mountain man-s woman, the one they sent as a joke, chubby girl from Pine Hollow. The old shame tried to rise in her throat. She swallowed it and kept her chin level. Thorne did not look at the whisperers. He simply walked toward the livestock pens, and she walked beside him. They stopped first at the horse pens. Thorne needed a steady draft animal to replace one that had gone lame. He stood ve kepi hat, his arms crossed, studying the animals with a practiced eye. Mabel moved closer to the fence. One big bay gelding caught her attention. Broad-chested, calm-eyed, with clean legs and a steady way of standing. She watched how he shifted his weight, how he reacted when another horse bumped him. She had grown up watching her father trade animals. She knew what lasted through hard winters and long days of work. "That one," she said quietly, pointing with one finger. "He-s sound. See how he sets his feet. He one T spook easy. And he look pull steady. The gray beside him is pretty, but he's favoring the right front. You'll be doctoring him before winter." Thorne looked at the bay for a long moment, then at her. He gave one short nod and moved toward the auctioneer's stand when the bidding started. Mabel stayed at the fence, her hands resting on the rough wood. She did not push forward. She simply watched and waited. When Thorne returned after the bidding, he had bought the bay at a fair price, lower than he might have paid if he had gone in without her eye on the animal. They moved to the feed and supply wagons next. Mabel pointed out which sacks of grain looked freshest and which bundles of leather strapping were worth the extra coin. She suggested a particular kind of axle grease that would hold up better in the mountain cold. Thorne listened each time. He did not argue or dismiss her. He simply acted on what she said, and the trades went in his favor more often than not. By midday, the stares had changed. Some of the rough traders who had first whispered now nodded when Thorne and Mabel passed. One older man with a face like weathered leather even touched his hat brim in Mabel's direction. After she quietly advised Thorne on a batch of winter blankets that were better made than they first appeared, the small gesture of respect landed in her chest like a coal that had been banked for years and was only now being allowed to glow. They ate a simple meal at a food stall, thick stew and fresh bread. Mabel sat on a bench beside Thorne, her full figure taking up the space without apology. The sun was warm on her back. The noise of the auction surrounded them, but for the first time in public, she did not feel like she was being measured and found wanting. She felt useful. She felt seen for ve kep hat ate her hands and mind could do, rather than for the shape of her body or the scar on her cheek. Thorne finished his stew and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at Moat Favor across the rough table. His gray eyes were steady, but there was something new in them, a quiet acknowledgement that had not been there before the auction. "You have a good eye," he said. The words were short, but they carried weight. "Better than most men here." Mabel felt warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. She looked down at her hands, at the calluses and the small scar across one knuckle, from a splinter she had pulled the day before. No one had ever praised her practical sense in public before. No one had ever treated her opinion as worth acting on when other people were watching. "Thank you," she said softly. They loaded the wagon with the new horse tied behind, the feed and supplies secured under canvas. The afternoon light was turning golden as they started the long climb back toward the mountain. The valley fell away behind them. The air grew cooler and cleaner with every mile. Mabel sat beside Thorne again, her shawl loose around her shoulders now. The day had left a quiet satisfaction in her bones. She had stood in a crowd and been useful. She had been seen as more than the town's joke. Thorne drove in silence for a long stretch. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the steady clop of the new horse hooves, and the wind in the pines. Mabel let herself relax into the rhythm of it. She was almost asleep, against the side of the seat when Thorne spoke again, his voice low and rough. "Caleb asked about you at the auction." Mabel's eyes opened. She turned her head to look at him. Thorne kept his gaze on the road ahead, but his hands tightened slightly on the reins. He was there with his uncle. He told me he saw how you calmed the kitten when the others came. Said some of the other children didn't believe him when he told them you weren't mean like they said. Thorne was quiet for another long moment. He wanted to know if you were staying. The words hung between them in the cooling air. Mabel felt the dangerous spark inside her chest flare brighter. The boy, the one whose clothes were folded in the trunk, whose drawing was on the bark, had spoken for her, had seen her kindness and carried it back into the world. And Thorne had told him something. She did not know what. She wanted to ask what Thorne had answered. She wanted to ask what it would mean if Caleb came back to the mountain more often. She wanted to ask if there was room in Thorne's silent, guarded life for a woman the town had thrown away, and a boy who was learning to see past cruelty. But the questions stayed behind her teeth. The cost of keeping this fragile belonging was still unknown, and she was not yet ready to name it out loud. Thorne did not look at her. He simply drove the wagon, climbing steadily toward the dark line of pines and the cabin that waited above them. The new horse followed without protest. The supplies they had bought, they kept hat. Her help would make the winter easier. And somewhere in the valley behind them, a child had spoken her name with something that sounded almost like hope. Mabel pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched the road ahead. She did not know yet what it would cost her to keep any of it. But for the first time, she was beginning to believe she might be willing to pay. The wagon creaked to a stop in front of the cabin as the last light drained from the sky. The new horse stood quietly behind them, already learning the rhythm of this place. Thorne climbed down first and began unharnessing the team with the same steady hands that had driven them all day. Mabel sat for a moment longer on the hard seat, her shawl loose around her shoulders. The list of supplies they had bought, folded carefully in her lap. The path back down the mountain was still visible in the twilight. She could walk it if she chose. The auction had shown her she could be useful in the wider world. She had money from the small wages Thorne had insisted on giving her for the work in the barn. She could find a place in another settlement where no one knew the town's joke. She did not move. Thorne finished with the horses and turned toward the barn. He stopped at the edge of the roof overhang and looked up. One large hand resting on a support post. A loose board had lifted in the wind during their absence. Rain was coming. Mabel could smell it in the air. Sharp and clean. The repair would not wait until morning. He spoke without turning. Roof needs fixing before the storm. What Luglung do it at first light. Mabel climbed down from the wagon. Her boots found the familiar ground. She walked to the barn and stood beside him, looking up at the same loose board. The work would be high and awkward, the kind of labor that required balance and strength, and someone to hand tools without dropping them. She could offer to help. She could also turn, walk into the cabin, gather her small bundle, and be gone before the rain started. No one would stop her. Thorne had never locked the door. The town's cruelty waited at the bottom of the mountain. But so did the chance to disappear into a place where no one expected anything from her at all. She chose the roof. What Luglung help, she said. The words came out steadier than she felt. What can pass what you need? Hold the boards steady from below. Mort met not afraid of heights if the ladder is sound. Thorne looked at her then. His gray eyes searched her face for a long moment, as if he were measuring whether she understood what she was offering. Not just the work. The choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. He gave one short nod. They worked as the first drops of rain began to fall. Thorne climbed the ladder with the new boards and tools, while Mabel stayed on the ground at first, sorting the nails and handing up what he asked for. The wood was rough under her palms. The wind tugged at her skirt and shawl. When he needed someone to hold a board in place from the inside while he secured it from above, she climbed the ladder herself, moving carefully, her full figure balanced with the same quiet endurance that had carried her through years of being told she was too slow and too soft for hard things. Thorne did not rush her. He waited, one hand steady on the beam, until she was in position. His voice when he spoke was low and close in the narrowing space between them. "Hold it there." Mott EV got the other end. She held the board. Her arms trembled with the effort after the long day, but she did not let go. The rain grew heavier, sliding down the back of her neck and soaking into her dress. Thorne worked quickly and surely above her, his large hands making the dangerous work look almost simple. When the last nail was driven and the board was secure, he climbed down and offered her his hand for the last step. She took it. His fingers closed around hers with careful strength, steadying her as she found the ground again. They stood together under the repaired overhang while the rain drummed on the new wood. Mabel's breath came fast from the climb and the work. Her hair had come loose from its tie and stuck to her cheeks in wet strands. She pushed it back with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of pine sap on her skin. Thorne watched the motion without speaking. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a clean cloth he must have carried from the auction. He held it out to her without a word. She took it and wiped her face and hands. The cloth smelled faintly of the soap he used and of wood smoke from his cabin. The mother cat appeared at the barn door, her fur fluffed against the rain, and meowed once as if to scold them for working in the weather. Mabel laughed under her breath, a small surprised sound, and bent to scratch behind the cat's ears. The animal leaned into her touch with the same trust it had shown since the first day. They carried the leftover supplies into the barn and stacked them where they belonged. Mabel moved with the same careful order she had used when she first began cleaning the space. Thorne helped without being asked, lifting the heavier crates and placing them exactly where she pointed. When everything was put away, the barn smelled of new wood, wet pine, and the clean sharpness of the rain. It felt like a place that could survive the winter. Mabel stood in the center aisle and looked at what they had done together. The roof was sound. The supplies were organized. The cat and her kittens were safe in their box. She had chosen to stay when she could have left. She had given her strength and her time, and her willingness to climb into the rain and hold a board while a man she barely knew drove nails above her head. The choice had not felt like sacrifice in the moment. It had felt like the only thing she could do if she wanted to keep the small, dangerous spark that had begun to glow inside her chest. Thorne walked to the barn door and stood looking out at the rain. His broad shoulders were dark with water. After a long moment, he spoke without turning around. "You could have gone today. At the auction. Plenty of chances to slip away while Moat was bidding. You didn't, T." Mabel wiped her hands on her apron, even though they were already clean. She walked to stand beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence against the cold air coming in from the storm. "What can no of a kep," she said. He was quiet for so long she thought he would not speak again. The rain fell harder. Lightning flickered somewhere over the peaks, followed by distant thunder. When Thorne finally turned his head to look at her, his gray eyes held something she had not seen before. Not softness exactly, but a kind of weary honesty. "Caleb's mother chose to stay too," he said. The words were rough, as if they had been kept behind his teeth for years. It didn't end well for her. Mabel felt the breath leave her lungs. She had known the trunk and the drawing and the small clothes belonged to someone Thorne had lost. She had not expected him to name it out loud. The rain drummed on the roof they had just repaired. The cat purred at her feet, and the man who had stood between her and the town's cruelty was looking at her, as if he were already bracing for the day she might choose to leave the way the boy's mother had left him. She did not ask what had happened. She did not promise she would never go. She only stood beside him in the open doorway, while the storm moved over the mountain and let the silence between them hold the weight of everything. Neither of them was ready to say. Outside, the rain turned the path to mud. Inside the barn, the tools hung in their ordered rows, and the new supplies waited for winter. And somewhere in the dark between the lightning flashes, a small spark of belonging burned a little brighter and a little more dangerously than it had that morning. The storm lasted through the night and into the gray morning. Mabel slept fitfully on a pallet Thorne had made for her near the hearth in the cabin. The blanket from the barn was draped over her, still carrying the scent of pine and the man who had given it. She woke to the sound of rain on the roof they had repaired together, and the low crackle of the fire Thorne must have tended while she slept. The cabin felt smaller with the storm pressing against the windows, but it also felt warmer than any place she had known in years. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Thorne where he sat in the chair by the fire, his head tilted back, eyes closed but not fully resting. His axe rested against the wall within reach. Even in sleep he kept watch. Mabel moved to the small kitchen area and began heating water for coffee and broth, from the supplies they had brought back from the auction. The simple acts of measuring and stirring steadied her hands. She had chosen to stay. She had climbed onto a wet roof and held boards while this man worked above her. The choice still hummed in her chest like a live coal. A knock came at the cabin door just as the broth began to steam. Thorne was on his feet before the sound finished echoing. He crossed the room in 3 strides, axe in hand, and opened the door. Cold wind and rain blew in. Standing on the step, soaked to the skin and shivering, was Caleb. The boy's dark hair was plastered to his forehead. A cut on his cheek bled faintly. His small frame was wrapped in a coat that was too thin for the weather, and his eyes were wide with a fear that had nothing to do with the storm. "Uncle said Mort couldn't come here anymore," the boy said. His voice small but steady. "He said you chose the joke over your own kind. But Mott ran anyway. Can Mort stay? Just until the rain stops." Thorne looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." Caleb stepped inside, water dripping from his coat onto the wooden floor. His eyes found Mabel where she stood by the hearth. For a heartbeat he looked uncertain, as if he expected her to turn him away, the way the town always had. Then he saw the way she was already reaching for a clean cloth and a pot of warm broth. Mabel felt the pull immediately, the same instinct that had made her gentle with the kitten, the same quiet need to wrap something small and hurting in safety. Her hands moved before her mind could stop them. She crossed the room, knelt in front of the boy so their eyes were level, and began to dry his hair with the cloth. Her touch was careful, almost hesitant at first. The old voices rose in her head like they always did when she came too close to anything that looked like caring for a child. "You re too big. Too soft. Too scarred. What kind of mother could a woman like you ever be?" She pushed the voices down and kept drying his hair. The cloth was rough but warm from the fire. Caleb did not pull away. He stood very still, his small shoulders relaxing fraction by fraction under her hands. "You re-hurt," she said quietly. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Let me see that cut." She cleaned the small wound with kept hot gentle fingers, and a bit of the broth cooled on a cloth. The boy winced once but did not complain. When she finished, he looked at her, with something like wonder. "You re not like they said," he whispered. "At school some kids still laugh. But I told them what I saw. With kitten. They didn't believe me." Mabel's hand stilled for a moment on the cloth. She felt Thorne's presence behind her, solid and silent, watching. She wanted to pull the boy into her arms and promise him that no one would ever make him feel small again. The want was so strong it hurt behind her ribs. But the fear came with it, cold and familiar. What if she tried to be something like a mother to this child, and failed? What if the town was right, and she was only good for cleaning barns and being the butt of jokes? What if she let herself care? And then Caleb looked at her the way her own family had, with disappointment and disgust. She finished drying his hair and stood up slowly, her full figure unfolding with the same careful grace she used when she worked in the barn. She straightened her apron without realizing she was doing it, smoothing the fabric over her rounded belly and hips, as if she could make herself smaller, more acceptable, more like the kind of woman a child would want to call mother. Thorne had moved to the hearth. He ladled broth into a bowl and set it on the small table with a piece of bread. He did not tell the boy to eat. He simply waited. Caleb sat and ate with the careful hunger of a child who had learned not to expect full meals. Mabel stood at the edge of the firelight, her hands clasped in front of her apron, and watched the boy's small shoulders hunch over the bowl. Every part of her wanted to sit beside him, to tuck the blanket around his legs, to ask what had happened at his uncle's house that had driven him into the storm. But the fear held her back like a hand on her chest. She had spent her whole life being told she was too much and not enough at the same time, too big to be pretty, too slow to be useful, too plain to be wanted. The idea that she could be trusted with a child's heart felt like standing on the edge of a cliff she had been warned against her entire life. One step and she would fall, one mistake, and she would prove every cruel word true. Thorne's voice came low from the other side of the fire. "You can sleep by the hearth tonight. We'll figure the rest in the morning." Caleb nodded, his eyes already heavy with exhaustion and warmth. He finished the broth and bread and let Mabel guide him to the pallet she had used. She spread the blanket over him, with hands that only trembled a little. The boy's small fingers caught the edge of her sleeve for a moment. "Thank you," he whispered. Then his eyes closed and sleep took him almost at once. Mabel stood looking down at him for a long time. The firelight played across his small face, softening the bruise on his cheek and the worry lines that no child should have. She wanted to kneel again and smooth his hair back from his forehead. She wanted to promise him safety and warmth, and someone who would never send him back into a storm. The wanting was so fierce it made her throat ache. But the fear was louder. What if she was the storm this time? What if letting herself care for this boy only brought him more pain when the town came again, or when Thorne decided the joke had gone on long enough? She turned away from the pallet and walked to the window. The rain still fell, blurring the dark shapes of the pines. Behind her, she heard Thorne settle back into his chair. The cabin was quiet, except for the fire and the soft breathing of the sleeping child. Mabel pressed her forehead to the cold glass and closed her eyes. She had chosen to stay when she could have left. She had climbed onto a wet roof and held boards for this man. Now a child slept under her blanket, and part of her heart was already reaching for him with a tenderness she had never allowed herself to feel. The fear and the wanting pulled in opposite directions until she could hardly breathe. She did not know which one would win. Behind her, Thorne spoke so quietly, she almost missed the words. "He called you Ma in his sleep." Mabel's eyes flew open. She turned slowly. Thorne was watching her from the chair, his gray eyes steady in the firelight. The boy stirred once on the pallet and settled again. One small hand curled under his cheek. The word hung in the warm air between them, like a question neither of them was ready to answer. Outside, the storm moved over the mountain. Inside the cabin, a child slept under a blanket that smelled of pine and safety. And a woman, who had spent her life being told she was unworthy of love, stood frozen between the fear of failing him and the terrifying, impossible hope that she might not. Mabel moved to the chair across the fire from Thorne and lowered herself into it slowly. The wood creaked under her weight, in the same familiar way the wagon seat had on the ride back from the auction. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, even though the cabin was warm. The firelight painted gold across the rough floorboards and caught on the wet edges of Caleb's coat, where it hung to dry near the hearth. The boy slept deeply on the pallet, one small hand curled under his cheek, his breathing soft and even. For the first time since the wagon had left her at the barn, the cabin did not feel like a place she was only passing through. She lifted one hand and let her fingers trace the small faded scar on her left cheek. The skin there was smoother than the rest of her face, a pale line that had never quite faded, no matter how many years passed. She had been 12 when her brother pushed her during one of his rages. The rock at the edge of the yard had split the skin and left this mark. Her father had told her to stop crying, that it would make her face even less worth looking at. The town had used the scar as another reason to mock her, another flaw to add to the list of her size, her slowness, her plainness. Her fingers moved over it now without thinking, the old habit of checking that it was still there, still proof of everything she had been told she was. The fire popped softly. Rain drummed on the roof they had repaired together. Mabel let her gaze rest on the flames and let the thoughts come that she usually kept locked away. Thorne had seen the scar the first day. He had looked at her face the way he looked at everything else, steady, without flinching or lingering too long on the flaw. He had never mentioned it. He had never used it as a reason to turn her away or to make her feel smaller than she already felt. When he had stood between her and the town, when he had let her hold the board on the roof while he worked above her, when he had brought her water and bread and the blanket that still smelled of him, he had treated her like a person whose hands and heart were worth something. Not like a joke, not like a burden, not like the woman the town had sent to be broken. And now there was Caleb. The boy had come through the storm, because this cabin was the only safe place he knew. He had let her dry his hair and clean his cut without pulling away. He had eaten the broth she made and fallen asleep under the blanket she had spread over him. In his sleep he had called her Ma. The word had landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she could not stop. She wanted to be that for him. The wanting was so strong it made her throat tight. She wanted to be the person who made sure he never had to run through a storm again. She wanted to be the steady hands and the quiet voice, and the safe place he could come to when the world was cruel. But the fear was louder. What if she tried and failed? What if the town was right and a woman like her, too big, too scarred, too used to being unwanted, could never be a good mother to anyone? What if she let herself love this boy and this silent mountain man, and then lost them both, the way Caleb's mother had lost everything? The thought of opening her heart that wide again after years of keeping it small and guarded felt like standing at the edge of a cliff she had spent her whole life being warned against. One step, and she would fall. One mistake, and every cruel word the town had ever spoken would be proven true. Her fingers stilled on the scar. She let her hand fall to her lap and watched the firelight move across her skin. The hands that had been mocked for being soft and slow had cleaned a filthy barn until it shone with order. They had held a board steady in the rain, while a giant of a man trusted her to do it right. They had dried a child's hair and cleaned a child's cut without shaking too badly. Those hands had done good things here. Maybe they could do more. Across the fire, Thorne sat in his chair with the same stillness he carried everywhere. His gray eyes were half closed, but she knew he was not asleep. He was watching the boy the way he had watched her that first day. Steady, patient, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for someone to decide they were safe. The axe rested against the wall within reach, but his shoulders were not as tight as they had been when the group from town had come. He looked almost at peace, with a child sleeping under his roof, and a woman sitting across from him who had chosen to stay when she could have gone. Mabel felt the spark inside her chest again. The same dangerous, fragile hope that had begun the day she decided to help with the roof instead of walking down the mountain. It was brighter now. It hurt a little more. She had given her strength to this place. She had given her care to this child. She had let herself hope that maybe, in this quiet cabin on the edge of the world, she could be more than the town's joke. The hope felt like a sacred thing she was choosing to carry, even though it might cost her everything if it broke. She looked at Thorne, and found him looking back at her. The firelight caught on the edges of his beard and the lines around his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain softened outside. The boy on the pallet sighed in his sleep, and turned onto his side, one small hand reaching out as if searching for something to hold. Mabel's fingers twitched with the urge to reach back. Thorne's voice came low and rough, barely louder than the fire. "You don't have to decide tonight." Mabel swallowed. Her throat felt tight. She nodded once, because words were too dangerous right now. She turned her gaze back to the flames, and let the warmth of the fire sink into her bones. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the warmth reached all the way to the cold places she had kept guarded for years. She did not know yet what it would cost her to keep hoping. She only knew that for the first time, she was choosing to try. Outside, the storm moved on. Inside the cabin, a child slept under a blanket that smelled of safety. A mountain man kept watch, with an axe within reach. And a woman who had spent her life being told she was unworthy sat by the fire, tracing old scars and letting herself believe, just for tonight, that maybe she could be worthy of this. The morning after the storm dawned clear and cold. Sunlight slanted through the cabin windows and turned the lingering puddles outside into mirrors of blue sky. Mabel woke to the smell of coffee and the soft sound of Caleb moving around the hearth. The boy was trying to be quiet, but his small feet scuffed the floorboards as he carried wood to the fire. Thorne was already outside splitting more logs, the steady rhythm of the axe a familiar comfort. Mabel rose and smoothed her dress and apron with careful hands. She had slept better than she expected, wrapped in the blanket that still carried Thorne's scent. The boy had not woken again after calling her Ma in his sleep. She had lain awake for a long time, listening to the rain ease and the fire settle. And somewhere in the dark she had made a quiet decision. She would try. She would stay as long as they would have her. The fear was still there, but the hope had grown stronger than the voices that told her she was unworthy. She was stirring the last of the broth from the night before, when the sound of voices carried up the path. They were not the cautious voices of neighbors. These were sharp and familiar, her brother Elias and his wife Clara, and another man whose tone she recognized as one of her cousins. They had come before the sun was fully up, and they had not come alone. Mabel heard the creak of wagon wheels and the low murmur of more people waiting on the path. Thorne's axe stopped mid-swing. He set the tool down and walked to the cabin door without hurry. Caleb moved to stand behind Mabel, one small hand catching the edge of her apron. She felt the tug and placed her hand over his without thinking. The boy's fingers were cold. Elias's voice came through the door before Thorne opened it. "Mabel, we know you in there. The whole valley is talking. You living up here like you belong to that beast. We've come to take you home before you disgrace the family any further." Clara's higher, crueler tone followed. "Come out, girl. Your little holiday is over. The town won stand for one of their own playing house with a monster. You've had your fun. Now it's time to remember your place." Mabel felt the old shame try to rise, but it did not take hold the way it once had. The barn she had cleaned and ordered was behind her. The child whose hair she had dried was holding her apron. The man who had stood between her and every cruelty the town offered was at the door. She straightened her spine and stepped forward, so she stood just behind Thorne's shoulder when he opened the door. The group stood in the clearing. Elias, Clara, her cousin, Neef, and two more men from Pine Hollow she recognized from the earlier visit. Their faces were set in the same mocking lines she had known all her life. Elias held a length of rope in one hand as if he expected to need it. Thorne filled the doorway. He did not raise his voice. He did not lift the axe he had left by the chopping block. He simply stood, and the group shifted back half a step before they caught themselves. "She stays," Thorne said. The words were the same ones he had used before, but this time there was something final in them. This is her home now, if she chooses it. Elias laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Home with you? She's our blood mountain man. She belongs with her family, not playing servant to a beast who lives alone, because no decent woman would have him. We heard what happened at the auction. The whole valley knows she's warming your bed and cleaning your barn like some kept woman. We're here to save her from herself before it's too late." Clara's eyes found Mabel over Thorne's shoulder. "Look at you. Standing there like you re somebody. That dress is stretched across your fat like you think you re pretty now. Come home, Mabel. We Luglung find you work in the kitchens where you belong. No one has to know how far you fell." One of the men behind them muttered something about the giant's whore and laughed. Mabel felt Caleb's hand tighten on her apron. She looked down and saw the boy's face, pale, angry, and scared all at once. He had heard every word. He had seen the rope in Elias' hand. Something fierce and protective rose in her chest, hotter than the shame they tried to pour over her. She stepped around Thorne and stood in the open doorway. The morning sun fell across her full figure and caught on the faded blue of her dress. She did not shrink. She did not lower her eyes. "Mort met not going back," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear. "This is where Mort choose to be. With him. With the boy. You can take your rope and your cruelty and go." Elias's face darkened. "You think that monster will keep you when the town comes with more than words? You think he Luglung stand between you and all of Pine Hollow when they decide the joke has gone too far? Blood is blood. Mabel. You Luglung come crawling back when he tires of you. And we want to be so forgiving next time." Thorne moved. Then he stepped forward until he stood between Mabel and the group, his massive frame blocking them completely. His voice dropped even lower, but it carried across the clearing like thunder rolling off the peaks. "She is under my protection. So is the boy. Anyone who comes here with ropes or threats will answer to me. Go back to your town. Tell them the mountain has chosen. This ends here." The group stared at him. For a moment no one moved. Then Clara grabbed Elias's arm and pulled. "Come on." She made her choice. Let the beast have her. She'll regret it soon enough. They turned and walked back down the path. The wagon creaked as they climbed in. Elias threw one last look over his shoulder. A look full of the same contempt he had shown her since they were children. Then the wagon rattled away, taking the sound of their voices with it. Silence settled over the clearing. Mabel stood in the doorway with Caleb still clutching her apron. Her hands were shaking, but she did not let them show. Thorne remained where he was, his back to her, watching the path until the wagon disappeared into the trees. Only then did he turn. His gray eyes met hers. There was no triumph in them, only the same steady presence that had been there since the first day. He reached out slowly and rested one large hand on her shoulder. The weight of it was warm and solid. It was the first time he had touched her kept ite hot intention since the day on the roof. "You chose," he said quietly. "That matters more than blood." Mabel nodded. She could not speak past the tightness in her throat. Caleb looked up at her, his small face serious. "They were wrong about you," the boy said. "And about him." Thorne's hand stayed on her shoulder for another moment. Then he let it fall and turned back toward the woodpile. Mabel watched him go, the place where his hand had rested still warm through the fabric of her dress. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned. The broth still simmered. The blanket on the pallet still smelled of safety. But the morning light felt different now. The old betrayals had come to the door and been turned away. She had stood in front of them and chosen this place, this man, and this child. The cost of that choice was still unknown. But for the first time, Mabel did not feel alone in paying it. Caleb tugged on her apron again. "Can we make more bread today?" "The kind with the herbs from the auction." Mabel looked down at him and managed a small, tired smile. "Yes," she said. "We can." Behind her, Thorne's axe began to fall again, steady and sure. The sound was no longer the sound of solitude. It was the sound of a home being defended. And somewhere in the trees at the edge of the clearing, the wind carried the faint echo of wagon wheels fading down the mountain. The wagon wheels faded into the distance until only the wind in the pines remained. Mabel stood in the doorway with Caleb still clutching her apron, the morning sun falling across them both. Thorne's hand stayed on her shoulder for another long moment, warm, solid, and steady in a way nothing in her life had been before. Then he let it fall and turned back toward the woodpile without another word. She watched him go, the place where his hand had rested still tingling through the fabric of her dress. The family she had been born to had come with ropes and cruelty, and the demand that she return to the life that had broken her. They had been turned away by a man who owed her nothing, and now that man had touched her with intention, as if to remind her that she was no longer alone in this fight. Caleb tugged on her apron again. His small face was pale but determined. "They want to take you," he said, as if making a promise he intended to keep. "Thorne won tea, let them. And I won tea either." Mabel looked down at him and felt something crack open in her chest, something she had kept locked for years. She knelt slowly so their eyes were level and smoothed a strand of his dark hair back from his forehead with fingers that no longer trembled quite so much. "No," she said quietly. "They won to take me." The words felt like a vow she was making to both the boy and herself. They returned to the small tasks of the morning, as if the confrontation had been nothing more than a passing storm. Caleb helped carry small pieces of wood to the hearth while Mabel finished the broth and set out the last of the bread from the auction supplies. Thorne split wood with the same steady rhythm as always, but every now and then his gaze drifted toward the cabin door, as if checking that she was still there. Later, when the sun was higher and the air had warmed, Mabel took Caleb to the barn to show him how she had organized the tools and supplies. The boy followed her with wide eyes, touching the ordered rows of jars and the neatly hung harnesses with something like awe. He had never seen a place made orderly by careful hands instead of chaos and neglect. Mabel showed him how to sort the small nails into the proper jar and how to check that the rake tines were clean before hanging it. Caleb worked beside her with serious concentration, his small fingers clumsy but willing. Every time he completed a task correctly, he looked up at her for approval, and every time she gave it with a quiet word or a small smile. The simple act of teaching him felt like claiming something she had never believed she deserved. Thorne appeared in the barn doorway after a while, his massive frame blocking the light the way it had that first day. He watched them for a long moment without speaking. Then he crossed to the workbench and picked up a small wooden mallet that had been out of place. He handed it to Mabel without a word, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest second. She took it and placed it in its proper spot on the pegboard she had cleaned weeks ago. When she turned back, Thorne was still there. His gray eyes held hers with the same steady intensity that had first frightened her, and now felt like the only safe thing in the world. "You don't have to go back," he said. The words were short, the way he always spoke when something mattered. "Not ever. This place is yours if you want it. The boy needs someone who won tea leave when it gets hard. Mott needs someone who sees the work and does it anyway." Mabel felt the breath leave her lungs. The claim was not loud or flowery. It was Thorne, simple, powerful, and final. He was telling her, in front of the child and in the place she had made clean with her own hands, that she was chosen. Not as a joke, not as a burden, not as someone to be used and discarded. She was wanted here, protected here, needed here. Caleb had stopped sorting nails and was watching them both with hopeful eyes. He did not speak, but the way he looked at Mabel made her chest ache with a tenderness so fierce it frightened her. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell Thorne that she would stay, that she would be whatever the boy needed, that she would stand beside this mountain of a man for as long as he would have her. The words were right there on her tongue, but the old fear rose with them, the memory of every time she had reached for something good only to have it torn away. The voices that had told her she was too big and too broken to be loved or trusted. They kept ite, hot, anything precious. Her hand moved without thinking. She reached up and touched the spot on her shoulder where Thorne's hand had rested earlier. The warmth was gone, but the memory of it remained like a brand. Thorne saw the motion. His eyes softened for a fraction of a second before the walls came back up. He gave one short nod, as if he understood the battle she was fighting inside herself, and turned to leave the barn. At the doorway, he paused. Without looking back, he spoke again, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You don't have to decide today. But know this, I won't send you away. Not for them. Not for anyone." Then, he was gone, the sound of his boots fading toward the woodpile. Mabel stood in the organized barn, with Caleb watching her, the mallet still in her hand and the ghost of Thorne's touch still warm on her shoulder. The boy stepped closer and slipped his small hand into hers without asking. She closed her fingers around his and held on. Outside, the axe began to fall again. Inside, the tools hung in their proper places and the morning light made everything look possible. And for the first time since the wagon had left her here, Mabel allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be the person this man and this child needed her to be. But the fear was still there, whispering that wanting something this much was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. The days after the family's visit passed in a quiet rhythm that felt almost like peace. Mabel and Caleb worked together in the barn and the cabin, the boy learning small tasks vekepte hot, serious concentration, and looking to her for approval after each one. Thorne split wood and mended fences and watched them both with the same steady gray eyes that had first seen her on that first terrible day. He did not speak of the confrontation again, but every evening he made sure the door was barred and the axe was within reach. Every morning he checked the path before letting Caleb play outside. Mabel felt the change in herself, like the slow warming of the ground after a long winter. She no longer woke with the old dread sitting heavy on her chest. She no longer measured every movement to take up less space. When Caleb called her name, she answered without hesitation. When Thorne's hand brushed hers while passing a tool or a cup, she did not pull away. The hope that had been so fragile was growing roots. On the 5th evening, after Caleb had fallen asleep on the pallet by the fire, Thorne sat across from her in his chair and spoke in the short, powerful way that was his alone. There's a chapel in the High Valley. Small. Honest. The preacher there marries folks who mean it. He looked at Moat Fahar across the firelight. Moat want to marry you there. Make it official. So no one can say you don't belong here. So the boy knows you re-staying. Mabel's breath caught. She had known this moment was coming in the quiet way Thorne did everything, deliberate, final, without flourish. She had felt it in the way he touched her shoulder after the family left, in the way he had said the place was hers if she wanted it. Still, the words landed with a weight that made her heart beat hard against her ribs. She looked at the sleeping boy, at the way his small hand rested near hers, even in sleep. And then at the man who had stood between her and every cruelty the world had offered. Yes, she said. The word came out steady. Moat will marry you. Thorne gave one short nod, as if her answer had been the only one he expected. Then he stood and added another log to the fire. The simple act, somehow sealing the promise between them. 3 days later they rode to the small log chapel in the High Valley. Caleb sat between them on the wagon seat, his legs swinging and his face bright, with a happiness he did not try to hide. The morning was clear and cold, the pines dusted, they kept a hot, early frost that sparkled in the sunlight. Mabel wore the same faded blue dress she had arrived in, freshly washed and mended at the hem. Thorne had brushed his coat and hat. Neither of them had anything new or fine. It did not matter. The chapel was exactly as Thorne had described, small, honest, built of logs with a simple cross above the door. A few people waited inside. The older trader from the auction who had tipped his hat to her stood near the back with his wife. Another man from the valley who had seen her help with the livestock nodded respectfully when they entered. No one from Pine Hollow had been invited. Her family was not there. The preacher was an old man with kind eyes and a voice worn smooth by years of mountain weddings and funerals. He did not make long speeches. He simply asked them to stand before him and speak what they meant. Thorne took Mabel's hand in his. His fingers were calloused and large, dwarfing hers completely. But his hold was careful. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes and spoke in his low, rough voice. Moat will protect you. Mort will stand with you. You are mine to keep safe. For as long as you Leglung have me. The words were short. They were everything. Mabel's throat tightened. She had spent so many years being told she was unworthy of protection or belonging. Now this man, this mountain of a man who had every reason to turn her away, was claiming her in front of witnesses who had chosen to see her worth instead of the town's joke. She squeezed his hand once hard and found her voice. Mort will stay. Mort will care for this place and for the boy and for you. Mort will not run when it is hard. You are mine to stand beside. For as long as you Leglung have me. Caleb stood beside them as their witness, his small face solemn and proud. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the boy let out a small whoop that made even the older trader smile. Thorne bent his head and pressed his forehead to Mabel's for a brief moment, the closest thing to a kiss he gave her in that small chapel. It was enough. They signed the simple record with the preacher. The older trader and his wife came forward to shake Thorne's hand and nod at Mabel. They kept a hot, genuine respect. No one mocked. No one sneered. For the first time in her life, Mabel stood in a public place and was treated as a woman of value, rather than a burden or a joke. They rode back to the cabin as the sun began to set. Caleb chattered the whole way about how he was going to help Thorne build a bigger bed, and how he wanted to learn to split wood like a man, now that he had a proper family. Mabel listened with a smile she could not hide. Thorne drove with one hand on the reins and the other, resting near hers on the seat. Not quite touching, but close enough that she felt the warmth of it. When they reached the cabin, Thorne lifted Caleb down first, then turned and offered his hand to Mabel. She took it and let him help her down, the simple courtesy feeling like another vow. Inside, the fire was already laid. The cat and her kittens greeted them from the hearth. Everything was exactly as they had left it, yet everything was different. After Caleb had been fed and settled on his pallet with extra blankets, and a story Thorne told in his low, rumbling voice, the boy fell asleep quickly, worn out from the day's excitement. The cabin grew quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the child. Mabel stood by the window looking out at the dark pines. Thorne came to stand behind her. He did not touch her at first. Then, slowly, he rested his large hands on her shoulders the way he had after the family left. She leaned back into the solid warmth of him without thinking. "We remarried now," she said softly, almost to herself. "Yes," Thorne answered. His voice was low against her ear. "You my wife. The boy's mother, if you want to be. No one can take that from you." Mabel closed her eyes. The words settled into the places that had been empty for so long. She turned in his arms and looked up at him. In the firelight, his face was all strong lines and quiet strength. She reached up and touched the scar on her own cheek, then let her hand fall. "Not want to be," she whispered. "Not met afraid I want to be enough. But mort want to try." Thorne's hands tightened on her shoulders. Not painfully, but with a steadiness that anchored her. He looked at her for a long moment, the gray of his eyes dark in the low light. "You already are," he said. Then, after another pause, the words came rougher, pulled from somewhere deep. Caleb's mother tried to stay. The town wouldn't let her. Mort couldn't stop them. "I won't fail you the same way." Mabel felt the breath leave her. The story she had only glimpsed in the trunk, and the drawing, and the small clothes was finally spoken, even if only in pieces. She understood now why Thorne had been so careful, so protective, so slow to let anyone close. He had lost before. He was terrified of losing again. She reached up and placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady beat beneath her palm. "You want to fail me," she said. "We'll stand together, whatever comes." Thorne closed his eyes for a moment, as if the words were too much and not enough all at once. When he opened them again, he bent his head and kissed her, slow, careful, and full of the same quiet power that had defined every choice he had made since the day she arrived. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines. Inside the cabin, a child slept peacefully under extra blankets. A fire burned warm and steady, and a woman who had once been left as a cruel joke stood in the arms of the man who had chosen her, married and protected and finally home. But even as she rested her head against his chest, Mabel could not quite silence the whisper that still lived in the back of her mind. The town had not accepted this. Her family had not accepted this. And somewhere out there, the people who had tried to drag her back once were already planning how to try again. The weeks after the wedding unfolded like pages in a story Mabel had never dared to imagine for herself. The cabin that had once felt like a temporary shelter became a home through the steady work of her hands. She mended the curtains with careful stitches, hung dried herbs from the rafters, and arranged the simple furniture so that the fire's warmth reached every corner. The barn remained her domain as well. Tools stayed in their ordered rows. The cat and her kittens had a permanent clean box near the door, and fresh straw was laid each week without complaint. The space no longer carried the scent of neglect. It smelled of pine, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the bread she baked almost every other day. Caleb changed with the cabin. The wary, hungry boy who had arrived in the storm slowly gave way to a child who laughed more easily and slept without nightmares. He followed Mabel through her daily tasks, like a small shadow, asking questions, offering to help, and looking up at her with open trust. One morning he woke and called her Ma without hesitation or fear, the words slipping out naturally as he asked for another slice of bread. Mabel had frozen with the knife in her hand, the simple syllable hitting her harder than any blow the town had ever dealt. She had turned, knelt, and pulled him into her arms without a second thought. The reluctance that had once made her hands hover, and her heart doubt had melted somewhere in the quiet days of shared work and small kindnesses. She no longer feared she would fail him. She only feared losing the right to try. Thorne watched the change in both of them, with the same steady presence he brought to everything. He did not speak often of what he saw, but his actions said enough. He began leaving small things for her. A smooth piece of wood he had carved into a spoon, a length of good wool he had traded for at the edge of the valley, a new tin of salve for the small cuts that came with work. One evening he came in from the cold, carrying an extra blanket he had mended himself with large, careful stitches. He laid it across the bed without comment, but when Mabel touched it later, she found it still warm from his hands. The small domestic acts from a man who had lived so long in silence felt like the deepest kind of claiming. Mabel found herself humming while she worked, old tunes her mother had taught her, soft and low under her breath as she kneaded dough or stirred stew or mended Caleb's small clothes. The sound surprised her at first. She had not hummed in years. Now the cabin often held the quiet music of her voice, mixed with Caleb's chatter and the steady rhythm of Thorne's axe outside. The three of them fell into a rhythm that felt older and truer than anything the town had ever offered her. One particular afternoon stood out in her memory like a single clear note in a long song. The sky had been heavy with the promise of snow. Mabel had been teaching Caleb how to properly bank the fire for the night when Thorne came in carrying an armload of wood. He stopped in the doorway and simply watched them. The woman who had once been left as a cruel joke kneeling beside the boy, her full figure curved protectively as she showed him how to place the logs so the coals would last until morning. Caleb looked up, saw Thorne, and smiled the open, uncomplicated smile of a child who finally felt safe. Ma says if Ma do it right, the fire will still be warm when we wake up, the boy said proudly. Thorne's eyes met Mabel's across the room. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then he gave one of his rare, small nods, the closest thing to a smile he often offered, and carried the wood to the hearth. He knelt on the other side of Caleb and began helping with the banking, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness beside the boy's smaller ones. Mabel stayed where she was, watching the two of them work together, and felt something settle deep in her chest that had been rest for as long as she could remember. This was what she had been afraid of wanting. This was what the town had tried to tell her she could never have. And yet here it was. The fire, the child, the man who had chosen her, the home she had built with her own hands. The joy of being needed, of being loved without condition, of waking each morning to purpose instead of dread had replaced the old reluctance almost completely. She was not perfect. She still carried the scar on her cheek and the memories of every cruel word. But she was enough. For Caleb, for Thorne, for this small, fierce family they were becoming. That evening, after Caleb had been tucked in with extra blankets and a story Thorne told in his low, rumbling voice, Mabel stood at the window looking out at the first flakes of snow beginning to fall. Thorne came to stand behind her, the way he often did now, his large hands resting on her shoulders. She leaned back into him without hesitation. "You read different," he said quietly after a long moment. "With the boy. With the house. With me. Is..." Mabel turned in his arms and looked up at him. The firelight caught on the strong lines of his face and the gray of his eyes. She reached up and touched the scar on her own cheek, then let her hand rest over his heart instead. "Not not afraid of it anymore," she said. "Of being his mother. Of being your wife." Moat was, for a long time. Moat thought the town was right, that someone like me could be trusted with anything good. But you kept choosing me. And he kept needing me. And somewhere in all of that Moat stopped believing their lies. Thorne's hands tightened on her shoulders. He bent his head and rested his forehead against hers the way he had at the chapel. For a long moment, they simply stood there, breathing the same air, the snow falling silently outside. "I want to let them take this," he said at last. The words were short, but they carried the full weight of his protection. "Not the boy. Not you. Not what we've built here." Mabel closed her eyes and let the promise settle into her bones. She believed him. She had seen him stand between her and her own blood. She had seen him welcome a frightened child into his home without question. She had felt the steady strength of his presence every single day since the wagon had left her at the barn. But even as she rested in the safety of his arms, a small, cold thread of knowing moved through her. The town had not forgotten. Her family had not forgiven. And somewhere down the mountain, the people who had once come with ropes and mockery were already planning how to finish what they had started. The peace they had built was real. The love growing between the three of them was real. But the world outside the mountain had not changed. And it was coming for them again. The peace they had built held for several more weeks, but Mabel had known it could not last forever. The mountain protected them, but it did not hide them. Word traveled. The story of the woman the town had sent as a joke, who had instead become the mountain man's wife and the boy's mother, spread in whispers and glances. Some people in Pine Hollow began to look away when Elias or Clara spoke. Others simply stayed silent, but not everyone was ready to let the old cruelty die. They came on a clear, cold morning when the first real snow had dusted the ground. Elias and Clara returned with 3 other men from town and a tired-looking preacher who had been convinced to intervene for the sake of the child. They stopped at the edge of the clearing as if they still expected Thorne to back down. Mabel saw them from the cabin window and felt the old familiar tightening in her chest. But it did not last. She wiped her hands on her apron, stepped outside, and stood beside Thorne with Caleb between them. The boy did not hide this time. He stood in front of Mabel, small shoulders squared, and looked straight at his uncle. "What meant not going with you," Caleb said clearly. His voice carried across the clearing. "This is my home. She's my ma. Thorne is my pa now. You can take me." Elias's face darkened. "Boy, you don't know what you saying. That woman isn't your blood. She's the town's cast off. She tire of playing house and leave you just like." "She won Caleb interrupted, his small voice fierce. "She stayed when everyone else left. She makes the fire last and the bread rise, and she does tit when she's angry. This is my family." One of the men behind Elias shifted uncomfortably. The preacher cleared his throat but did not step forward. Clara opened her mouth to speak, then closed it when she saw the way Thorne had moved, not aggressively, but with that same immovable presence that had turned them away before. His hand rested lightly on Mabel's back, steady and warm through the wool of her coat. Mabel looked at the people who had once held power over her. She saw the same contempt in Elias's eyes, the same cruelty in Clara's face. But she also saw something new, uncertainty. The barn behind her was clean and ordered. The cabin smoked with the scent of fresh bread and stew. Caleb stood openly at her side, choosing her without hesitation. Thorne stood at her other side, a mountain of quiet protection. The cruel joke the town had sent up the mountain had become something none of them had expected. A real family. "You can go," Mabel said. Her voice was calm. The same steady tone she used when she spoke to Caleb or tended the animals. "There's nothing here for you anymore. Not coming back. The boy isn't coming back. This is finished." Elias stared at her as if seeing a stranger. The woman he had mocked and pushed and sent away as punishment had become someone he no longer recognized, someone who stood tall, protected, and unafraid. Clara tugged at his sleeve, muttering that it wasn't worth it. One of the other men turned and walked back down the path without a word. The preacher looked at the ground, then at the small, warm cabin, and shook his head. They left without ropes, without dragging anyone, without violence. The power they had once held over Mabel had simply dissolved in the face of what she had built. The original cruel joke, sending the chubby, scarred girl to clean the feared giant S-barn as punishment, had become something entirely different. It had become her salvation, her home, her family. That evening, after the last of them had disappeared down the mountain, the three of them sat by the fire. Caleb leaned against Mabel's side, already half asleep, one small hand curled in hers. Thorne sat in his chair across from them, the axe resting by the door where it belonged but no longer needed that night. The cabin was warm. The stew had been good. The cat purred from the hearth. Mabel looked at the man who had chosen her and the boy who called her Ma, and she felt the last of the old fear finally loosen its grip. The town could whisper. Her blood could come and go. None of it could touch what they had made here. Thorne reached across the space between them and took her free hand in his. His thumb moved once, slowly, over her knuckles. "It is done," he said quietly. Mabel nodded. She believed him. Neth. Outside, snow began to fall in soft, steady flakes, covering the path that led down the mountain. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady. A child slept safely between the two people who had chosen him, and a woman who had once been sent as a joke finally, fully, it belonged. The cruel joke had become destiny. And destiny, at last, was kind. The story of Mabel, Thorne, and Caleb is one of quiet resilience and the kind of love that does not shout but simply refuses to move. It reminds us that the cruelties we endure do not have to define the families we choose or the homes we build. Sometimes the most powerful protection comes not from grand gestures but from steady presence. From a man who stands between you and the world, from a child who sees your heart before your scars, and from a woman who decides, one small act at a time, that she is worthy of staying. In the end, the mountain did not need magic or grand battles. It only needed 3 people willing to choose each other when the world told them they shouldn't. Mabel learned that her hands, once mocked for being too soft and too slow, could build order from chaos and safety from fear. Thorne learned that opening his solitary life to a rejected woman and a lost boy did not weaken him. It gave him something worth protecting with everything he had. And Caleb learned that family is not always the blood you are born to, but the people who stay when the storm comes. This tale was never about revenge or dramatic triumph over villains. It was about the slow, stubborn work of healing, the kind that happens in clean barns, shared meals, and small hands slipping into larger ones. It was about a woman who was sent to be broken and instead became whole. It was about a joke that turned into a home. May it remind you, wherever you are, that even the harshest beginnings can lead to the gentlest endings if we have the courage to stay, to choose Max Boat, and to let ourselves be chosen in return. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The story emphasizes themes of emotional healing, found family, and quiet resilience in a historical Western setting, and contains no graphic violence, explicit content, or harm to minors.